G'day guys, how's it going? So in this video, we're now going to talk about ownership and how it works with Rust, just from a theoretical level, just to begin with. So before we get to Rust though, let's think about how ownership would work in the real world, right? So think of purchasing a house, right? When we purchase a house, basically the house has to at least have that one owner that purchases it, right? At any given time. At least one. But it is possible that you can have two people own the same home, i.e., a husband and wife team, right? And it's also possible for an individual out there in the world to not own a house at all, right? It's not it's not very uncommon for that to be the case, especially in the modern world. When a person sells a house, a transfer of ownership can happen to the buyer. So the person who sells it no longer owns the home. The person who buys the home is now the new owner, right? So we do have this concept of transferring ownership. And then lastly, the house generally does not move from its current location, right? Technically, most of the time, that you don't move the house, you just buy the house and keep it in its place. So they're some of the things that we see in the real world in terms of ownership, right? However, how does ownership work in Rust? What does it mean? Well, essentially, when we talk about ownership in Rust, we're talking about variables and the data that's associated with them, right? So a variable is actually an owner of the piece of data that's stored, right? Now, the important thing to understand is that each piece of data can only have one owner at any given time. There is never two or more owners, which is different to what we see in real life, right? In Rust, and at least Rust, there are other languages that allow us to do this, but at least in Rust, you can never have more than one owner of a piece of data. Now, the lifetime of that piece of data is now linked to the scope of the variable. So we've already spoken about scopes and how things are either not available or available inside of blocks and things of that nature. Well, the piece of data that's associated to that variable and its scope determines the life of the data, right? So as a result of that, when we initialize a variable to begin with, we call what is called the data type that we're trying to create. We call its constructor, and at that point, the data is either stored on the stack or heap, depending on the data type and basically, the size of it, things of that nature, right? And that is done using the data type, what we call a constructor. Now, I'm not going to discuss that in this video. We'll look at this a little bit later in a future video. Also, when the variable is no longer in scope, so i.e. we've come out of the block, with the entries obviously going to be removed from stack memory at that point, the variable. And along with that, the data associated to that ownership of that variable will also be deallocated. So say we have a username variable and that's pointing to a string in memory, say that has your name in it. When that variable goes out of scope, so too does the data. It gets destroyed. And how it gets destroyed is by using something called a destructor on the same data type. Again, we'll look at this a little bit more later. And then lastly, basically the behavior we're talking about here is a programming idiom called resource acquisition is initialization. And this is actually a idiom that's been out for a while and is usually associated with modern C++ development. But Rust also implements this same strategy. So just to reiterate, there are three rules of ownership in Rust. The first one is each value in Rust must have an owner, right? There can only be one owner at a given time. And lastly, when an owner goes out of scope, the value will be destroyed and what we also call dropped in Rust, right? And we'll look at basically something called a drop trait further on in the series. So that's it. That's a very high level understanding of ownership. In the next video, we'll actually look at some code and see how this ownership works in real time. So I'll see you all then.